specifically. But in terms of what Hamas did on October the 7th, do you accept that was an act of terrorism?
It's an interesting question because
once again, really.
It is.
No, it's a very straightforward question.
Because you're the person who would have called Nelson Mandela a terrorist while he was still in jail, and one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
Nelson Mandela himself was considered a terrorist, but he was not considered the greatest leader when he was fighting against the apartheid regime. The regime called him a terrorist. And so when Andrew says one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, I take that and I contextualize it to the South African experience, and I understand what it means. Andrew Tate and Piers Morgan had a debate on the issue of Israel and Palestine, or the conflict between Israel and Palestine. There were some really interesting takes that I want us to focus on. So without wasting much time, let's react to this video, and I'm going to share my thoughts.
I want to turn to the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. What is your view of this war?
I think when you call it a war, you're doing a disservice to the people who are having their limbs blown off by some of the most advanced technical weaponry on the planet. It is a genocide, and it is disgusting. And it doesn't matter which side of the political spectrum you fall on. When you observe a genocide in front of your very eyes, you should be disgusted.
Which side is waging genocide?
The Israelis are genociding the Palestinians, and you know it as well as everybody else does. That. Well, then it seems like your bosses are not allowing you to know it.
What do you think of what Hamas did on October the 7th?
Why are you starting the story in the middle, Piers?
I just asked you about the wider war. I'm now asking you specifically about Hamas.
I cannot professionally answer that question without talking about the context that led up to October 7th.
Well, nothing, to my mind, justifies what happened on October the 7th.
Look, everyone agrees that what Hamas did on October the 7th was horrific. It's uncalled for. No one supports that. But the argument or the focus of debate cannot be only what happened from October the 7th onwards. There were circumstances that drove to the events that happened on October the 7th. So we're going to just say October 7th and condemn Hamas, which they must be condemned, I agree. But we cannot just look on October the 7th. What led to October the 7th? So this is where I agree with Andrew Tate, that there needs to be context. We're going to just look on October the 7th and that be that. Let's continue.
Nothing justifies what happened before October the 7th, Piers. This is the exact point. So you're talking to a man, I don't know what answer you expect from me, because let's forget the fact that I'm a Muslim. You're talking to a man who is fighting oppression to the best of his ability because he believes that the people in charge of the world are enslaving us all, to the point where I detriment my own life. I end up in a jail cell because I'm speaking against oppression. Then you're asking me what I would do if my family was blown to pieces?
You're not in a jail. Hang on.
You're asking me what I would do if another government came along and blew my family to pieces?
You weren't put in a jail cell because of any oppression.
Absolutely I was.
No, you weren't.
Of course
you were put in jail cell because you've been accused of serious sexual crimes.
I would not have been accused if I was not monumentally successful in speaking the truth.
Let me ask you again. It's a simple question. Some people can answer it straight away, including pro-Palestinians people I've had on my program. Many are very quick to say absolutely. Do you believe Hamas are a terror organization?
And that's a very interesting question, but I think you're peddling asininities.
Well, just answer the question.
Can somebody do me a favor? Google asininities and find out if it's a word.
I know what it means.
If it's not, make sure it's added to Webster on Top G's orders.
Okay. Just, are they a terror group?
You're peddling asininities because I'll tell you why, Piers. Let me answer the question.
No, I'm not.
Of course you are.
It's a simple question.
That's like me asking...
I'll tell you why I asked. Because the UK, where you were born, prescribes Hamas as a terror organization.
They also prescribe me as dangerous to children in schools. Let me explain something to you, Piers.
You're not prescribed as that.
If I were to sit here and say, is stealing wrong? And you'd say yes, and I go, but what if the person stealing is trying to feed their family, and if they don't, their family are going to die? Is it still wrong? You're trying to take a very nuanced and complicated argument and reduce it down to one sentence, which is failure.
You're trying to equate stealing with a mob of terrorists breaking over a border, going to peaceful...
Is that what Israel did?
Wait a minute.
A mob of terrorists breaking over a border and killing people. Is that what Israel did?
Going through a border on October the 7th.
Oh, October the 7th.
Massacring young people at a festival, massacring families in their homes in a kibbutz, setting fire to them, cutting their heads off, killing babies.
Oh, killing 40 babies, that was true.
Well, fine.
Were the babies vaccinated?
Why are you being flippant?
I'm not being flippant. The point I am making...
I don't find that funny.
No, but the point I am making is that the media lies, firstly.
No,
secondly...
I can ask you about different things at the same time, right?
Sure.
So I'm asking you, first of all, specifically, what is your reaction to what happened on October the 7th?
Sure. I'll answer the question professionally. I do not condone the loss of human life on either side. I think anybody doing anything which directly damages civilians is disgusting and abhorrent. However, I would be an amateur if I could not sit and pretend I do not understand the motivations behind either side. This is not even me taking a side. I understand why Israel is doing what it's doing. I understand why Palestine is doing what it is doing. However, I still call the Israeli actions absolutely abhorrent and genocidal.
Okay, we're going to come to Israel's actions, I promise you. We will ask that question specifically. But in terms of what Hamas did on October the 7th, do you accept that was an act of terrorism?
It's an interesting question because once
It's not really.
It is.
It's a very straightforward
because
question.
you're the person who would have called Nelson Mandela a terrorist while he was still in jail, and one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
You know, this is it right here. One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And he mentions Nelson Mandela. The ANC were a party that supported peaceful protests and fighting the government through marching and all that sort of stuff. When they realized that that was not working, you know, the oppression was getting worse, and South Africans, especially the black majority in South Africa, were still being oppressed, and there were no signs of it slowing down. They came to a conclusion that an armed struggle was the solution. And that is when the ANC formed Umkhonto weSizwe, the Spear of the Nation, which is the military wing of the ANC. Now, they went to countries like Russia, Cuba, even other countries on the African continent like Angola, Zambia, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. They went, Umkhonto weSizwe, the Spear of the Nation, the military wing of the ANC, went for military training on those countries, which is why South Africa's relationship with Russia, especially the ANC's relationship with Russia, is the way that it is. They got military training from Russia and Cuba to some extent. And so when Andrew says another person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, when you understand the context of what's going on, of the blockade of, you know, Gaza has been called an open air prison, the biggest open air prison. There's oppression that is going on. And so obviously to the Palestinians, they will be considered, I'm not sure, but they would be considered as freedom fighters, while the rest of the world, especially Israel, because they were attacked, would consider them terrorists. And so another person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Nelson Mandela himself was considered a terrorist. He was considered a terrorist, and when he was arrested, was sentenced to life imprisonment, and we all know what happened. He spent 27 years, and when he came back, he negotiated, not just him and, you know, other political parties negotiated for terms of peace. But it was the ANC mostly that negotiated for peace terms. And that is how he becomes the leader that he becomes. But he was not considered the greatest leader when he was fighting against the apartheid regime. The regime called him a terrorist. And so when Andrew says one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, I take that and I contextualize it to the South African experience, and I understand what he means.
For me to answer the question, I have to be very professional, Piers. For me to sit on the outside in Romania with no personal involvement in Israel-Palestine, it's easy for me to say, yes, it was an act of terror. However, if I was in Gaza, if I was in an open-air prison, if my family had been annihilated by bombs from the sky, if everybody I knew had suffered the loss of a loved one, if I had no chance of any kind of freedom or democracy or standard of life, would I believe it was an act of terror, or would I believe it's an act of resistance against oppression? You have to be very careful how you answer these questions. So
what do you think?
I think I understand what happens when you take people and put them in such an inhumane condition. For anybody to sit and say that you're going to take people and put them in absolutely inhumane conditions and give them no standard of life, and they're not allowed to ever fight back, or they are terrorists.
But I can agree with you.
Anyone who does that is an amateur.
I can agree with you that the plight of the Palestinians for many decades has been absolutely shameful.
So what did we think was going to happen?
This just brings Andrew Tate's point home. Yes, what happened on October 7th was horrific, was cruel, was perhaps acts of terrorism, right? But you've got to consider the events that led to that. Gaza is considered an open-air prison. There are freedoms that the Palestinians are deprived. Their freedom of movement is limited. there's just a lot of things, there's just a lot of oppression that they have experienced. So you have to consider that, you have to take that into consideration. I do not support the actions of Hamas, and I condemn them, but also condemn the actions of Israel towards the killing of civilians. So it's a sensitive issue, but we have to look at it holistically. It cannot just start and end from October the 7th, because if we do that, we ignore the plight of the Palestinians for decades. I know that this is a sensitive topic and it might cause divisions, but this is the stance that South Africa has taken, the South African government. The ANC, the government that's in power, the EFF, the DA has chosen to abstain, or whatever that means. I don't understand the positions that the DA takes, but that doesn't matter. South Africa has taken a stance because the president of the ruling party has taken a stance to stand with Palestine. Whether that's wrong or right, time will tell. Guys, thank you for joining me. I hope this was informative for you, and hopefully it brought you some value. Thank you for joining me. God willing, I will see you on the next one.